They laughed when the old soldier dragged a broken rocking chair out of his dead brother's garage. His nephews fought over the truck, the tools, the savings account. But Chester Malone got the chair. And 3 weeks later, his service dog wouldn't stop circling it. The morning Harold Malone passed, the frost was still sitting on the fields outside Lacombe, Alberta. Chester got the call at 6:15. He was already up. Men who had spent years in the army rarely slept past 5, and Chester Malone was no exception. 31 years with the Canadian Forces, 2 deployments overseas, and a body that still woke to invisible alarms long after the uniform had been folded away for good. He sat on the edge of his kitchen chair and listened to his sister-in-law's voice on the phone. Quiet, careful, the kind of voice people use when they're trying to hold something together. Harold was gone. Chester set the phone down and looked out the window at the gray October sky. He and Harold had never been close the way brothers on television were close. No Sunday dinners, no fishing trips, no long phone calls. But Harold had always been there, in the way that brothers simply are. A constant presence at the edge of life. And now that presence was gone. Beside the kitchen table, a yellow Labrador retriever lifted his broad head and looked at Chester. The dog's name was Beau. He was 7 years old, a former military service dog, retired from active duty the same year Chester had been medically discharged. Someone at the Veterans Association had connected them. Chester still wasn't sure which one of them had needed the other more. Beau pushed himself up from the floor and walked over. He didn't make a sound. He simply leaned his warm weight against Chester's leg and stayed there. Chester reached down and rested a hand on the dog's back. A few days later, Chester drove the 4 hours south to Red Deer, where Harold had lived most of his adult life. The funeral was small. Chester sat near the back. Harold's sons, Chester's nephews, Garrett and Fletcher, stood near the front in pressed shirts, already looking like men thinking about paperwork. Garrett was 38, a real estate agent from Calgary. Fletcher was 34, ran a landscaping company out of Camrose. Neither of them had visited Harold more than twice in the last year. Chester knew this because Harold had mentioned it, not bitterly, just plainly, the way old men sometimes report facts without wanting sympathy. After the service, everyone gathered at Harold's property outside town. A modest acreage, 5 acres of flat prairie land, a 2-story farmhouse with green shutters that needed painting, 2 equipment sheds, and a detached garage that Harold had used as a workshop for 40 years. Garrett and Fletcher moved through the house like men with a checklist. Chester watched from the porch with Beau sitting at his feet. There was a lawyer, a man named Kellerman, thin and unhurried, who arrived after lunch with a brown folder and set it on Harold's kitchen table. Everyone gathered around. Harold's estate was modest but not nothing. The farmhouse and the land, a savings account, a pickup truck barely 3 years old, woodworking tools in the garage, a full set, a small collection of antique furniture Harold had spent decades restoring as a hobby. Kellerman read the will in a flat, professional voice. The land and farmhouse went to Garrett, the elder son, with the condition that Fletcher receive a cash settlement equivalent to half the appraised value. The pickup truck went to Fletcher outright. The savings account was split evenly between the two of them. Then Kellerman cleared his throat. To his brother, Chester Malone, Harold left the rocking chair. Garrett looked up from the table. The rocking chair? Kellerman checked the document, the antique rocking chair stored in the garage workshop. Yes. Fletcher made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. That old wreck? Garrett shook his head slightly and looked at Chester with an expression that was almost pity. He wanted you to have that thing? Chester didn't answer right away. He looked at Kellerman. Can I see the garage? Of course, Kellerman said. They all walked out. The garage smelled of sawdust and machine oil, the smell of a man's long working life. Tools hung in careful rows along the walls. Half-finished projects sat on the workbenches. A cabinet door, a drawer frame, a set of wooden spindles still needing sanding, and in the far corner, beneath a canvas drop cloth, sat the rocking chair. Chester pulled the cloth away. It was old, clearly old, dark oak, heavily worn, the joints wrapped in what appeared to be layers of old glue and time. One of the rear legs had a crack running partway up. The seat slats were uneven. It looked like something you'd see at a junkyard sale with a $2 sticker on it. Fletcher crossed his arms. Dad spent 40 years collecting nice pieces and he leaves you that. Garrett shrugged. Sentimental, probably. Chester can have it. Chester looked at the chair for a long moment. Beau stood beside him, nose working. The dog moved forward and began sniffing along the base of the chair, slowly, methodically, the way he used to work when he was on active duty. Something about it caught Chester's attention. He didn't say anything. He just watched. Beau circled the chair once, then again. Then he stopped at the right rear leg, the one with the crack, and sat down. Chester frowned slightly. "What is it, buddy?" Beau didn't bark. He just looked at Chester with that calm, steady gaze. Then he looked at the leg. Then back at Chester. Fletcher rolled his eyes. "Even the dog thinks it's junk." They all laughed. Chester drove the rocking chair home in the back of his hatchback, wedged between a moving blanket and 2 bags of road salt. Beau sat in the passenger seat the entire 4 hours, occasionally turning his head to look at the chair through the rear seat. Chester noticed. He didn't say anything. Back in Lacombe, he carried the chair into the small living room of his bungalow on the edge of town. It was a modest house. 3 rooms, a kitchen with a window that faced the fields, a bathroom he'd updated himself over the summer. He'd bought it when he left the service because it was quiet, and because the property backed onto a stand of spruce trees where nothing moved too fast. He set the rocking chair near the wood stove and stepped back. It looked even worse indoors. The uneven slats, the cracked leg, the dark patches of old finish worn down to bare wood. Chester tilted it forward slightly and heard a soft rattle somewhere inside the frame. Loose joint, probably. Harold had clearly never gotten around to finishing the restoration. Beau walked over immediately. He sniffed the chair again, base, seat, right rear leg. Then he sat directly in front of it and stared. Chester shook his head. "You're going to have to tell me what you're thinking," he said. Beau's ears moved forward. Chester reached down and felt along the cracked leg. The wood was dry, old. The crack ran about 6 inches up from the floor. He pressed his thumb against it and felt something, a slight resistance at the edge of the crack, where the wood hadn't split clean, more like it had been scored. Deliberately. Chester looked closer, got down on one knee. The crack was too clean at the top, too uniform, and along the inside edge the gap was wider than it should be, if the leg had simply split under stress. Chester reached for the work light he kept near the wood stove and angled the beam at the base of the leg. There, a seam, running horizontally around the leg about an inch above the floor, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Beau's tail moved once. Chester straightened up and walked to the kitchen. He came back with a thin-bladed knife and crouched beside the chair. He worked the blade gently into the seam. There was resistance. Then, with a soft pop, the bottom section of the leg separated. A hollow cap, about 3 inches deep, disguised within the natural color and grain of the wood. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a small brass key. Chester sat back on his heels. He picked up the paper first, unfolded it. Harold's handwriting, slow, deliberate, the penmanship of a man who had learned to write when writing was still taught as his discipline. "Chester, I know this chair doesn't look like much. That's the point. I've been hiding things in plain sight my whole life. Look up the box. You'll understand why I didn't want the boys to have this. Use it the way I would have used it if I'd had the nerve." Harold. Chester read it twice, then a third time. Beau moved closer and sat beside him on the floor. Chester looked at the key, small brass with a number stamped into the bow. A safety deposit box key. He knew the shape well enough. He sat there for a while in the quiet of the house. Outside, the wind moved through the spruce trees at the edge of the field. The fire in the wood stove clicked and settled. Beau leaned against his arm. Chester had never been a man who moved quickly toward things he didn't understand. The forces had trained caution into him at a cellular level, but he also recognized this. Harold had spent 40 years restoring furniture. He had specifically left this chair. To Chester, he had written a note, and he had left a key. Harold had planned this. The next morning, Chester drove to the TD Bank in Red Deer. He knew Harold had banked there for decades. He brought the key, the will, and Harold's death certificate. After 2 hours of paperwork and a phone call to Kellerman, a branch manager led him to the safety deposit vault in the lower level. The box was large, one of the bigger sizes, 2 feet long. Chester had expected that. He hadn't expected the weight of it when the manager slid it onto the table and left him alone in the small private room. Chester lifted the lid. Inside, packed in neat rows within individual sealed envelopes, were bearer bonds. Old ones, issued decades ago. Chester was no financial expert, but he had been a logistics officer for 30 years, and he understood numbers. He began carefully lifting the envelopes, reading the face values. 10,000, 25,000, 50,000, dozens of them. He sat down, picked up his phone, called the lawyer. Kellerman's voice was measured, calm. "How many bonds, Mr. Malone?" Chester counted, 47 envelopes. After a pause, "Do you know the denominations?" Chester told him. There was silence on the line. "Then, Mr. Malone, I'd recommend you don't touch anything else in that box until we can bring in a financial assessor and verify authentication. If those bonds are genuine and current, the total value could be quite significant." "How significant?" Chester said. Another pause. "Based on what you're describing, and assuming they're authenticated, we could be looking at somewhere between $140 and $160 million. Chester set the phone down on the table. Beau was back in the car in the parking lot. Chester sat in the small private room of the TD Bank in Red Deer and looked at the open box in front of him. The fluorescent light hummed overhead. Harold, his older brother who never said much, who had spent his working life running a small equipment repair business in central Alberta, who drove a sensible truck and wore the same brand of work boots every year and complained about property taxes. Harold, who had apparently been sitting on a fortune for decades and had never spent it. Chester closed the box, folded his hands, thought about his brother for a long time. 2 weeks later, Garrett called. Chester had been expecting it. He was sitting at the kitchen table when his phone lit up. He let it ring 4 times before answering. Garrett's voice was different than it had been at the funeral. Harder. More deliberate. "There's something I need to talk to you about, Uncle Chester." Chester waited. Garrett cleared his throat. "I've been going through some of Dad's financial records, old ones, and there are some discrepancies. Accounts that were closed years ago. Money that moved and never showed up anywhere in the estate." Chester said nothing. "I think there might be assets that weren't declared in the will," Garrett continued. "Assets that belong to the estate, and by extension, to Fletcher and me." Chester set his coffee cup down. "Harold left me a chair, Garrett." Garrett's voice sharpened slightly. "He left you more than a chair, didn't he?" It wasn't a question. Chester looked across the kitchen at Beau, who was lying near the door to the hallway. The dog lifted his head. Chester exhaled slowly. "I think we should let the lawyers talk," Chester said. The lawyers talked for 2 months. Garrett had hired an estate litigation firm out of Calgary. They were capable and expensive, and they argued that any assets Harold had intentionally excluded from his declared estate, regardless of the form they took, should properly be considered estate assets, subject to distribution under Alberta law. Chester's lawyer, a woman named Pauline Greer, who practiced in Lacombe, argued the opposite. Harold's note, Harold's key, Harold's deliberate act of separating this asset from the declared estate and routing it specifically to Chester through a separate private mechanism. All of it pointed to a clear, documented testamentary intention. Harold had not hidden the bonds from the estate by accident. He had hidden them on purpose. The hearing was held in Calgary, at the Court of King's Bench. Chester dressed in the same suit he'd worn to his retirement ceremony from the forces, the one that still fit across the shoulders but pulled slightly at the collar. He sat at the table beside Pauline Greer and did not look at Garrett or Fletcher, who sat across the room with their attorneys. He looked at the front of the room instead. at the crest on the wall behind the judge's bench. Judge Patricia Okafor entered. The room rose. Chester sat with his hands folded on the table. Beau was outside with a retired constable from Lacombe who had volunteered to wait with him. Chester had considered leaving the dog at home, but Beau had seemed unsettled in the days before the hearing, and Chester had learned over 7 years to pay attention to that. Garrett's lawyers spoke at length about the principle of estate integrity, about Harold's obligation under law to disclose all assets, about the inequity of one beneficiary receiving a significant undisclosed inheritance, while others received only what was formally declared. Pauline Greer stood when it was her turn. She spoke for less time. She presented Harold's handwritten note, authenticated by a documents examiner. She presented the evidence of deliberate concealment in the chair leg. Photographs, a report from a woodworking expert who confirmed the hollow had been machined, not accidental. And she presented a letter discovered at the back of the safety deposit box. Underneath the bond envelopes, written in the same hand as the note inside the chair. Chester hadn't known about this second letter until Pauline showed it to him the week before the hearing. He had been inside that deposit box only once, and he hadn't reached all the way to the back. The letter was addressed to no one. It was dated 11 years ago. It explained, in Harold's plain and careful language, why the bonds existed and why he had chosen Chester. Harold had sold his equipment business to a national firm in his late 50s. The sale had been structured partly in bonds to reduce immediate tax exposure, a decision made with an accountant at the time, fully legal. Harold had kept the bonds liquid and private, not because he intended to hide them from anyone, but because he had watched his own sons through the years and had not liked what he saw. Not bad men, the letter said. Just men who would spend this too fast and too easily on things that would disappear. I watched them both, Harold had written. They're comfortable, and comfort has made them careless. Then he had written about Chester. Chester served 31 years. He came back quiet in ways I never fully understood. He doesn't ask for much, and he doesn't complain about what the service cost him. I have watched him live on very little without bitterness, and I have always thought that was a kind of character that deserved something more than what he's been given. The bonds belong to the chair. The chair belongs to Chester. Judge Okafor read the letter in full. Then she set it down. She asked Garrett's lead attorney whether he wished to respond to the contents of the letter. The attorney spoke for several minutes. He argued that a private letter could not legally substitute for a properly executed codicil to a will, that Harold's intentions, however documented, did not override his legal obligations as a testator. Judge Okafor listened. Then she looked at her notes. Then she spoke. In her view, the bonds had never been declared estate assets because Harold had removed them from his declared holdings through a legal transaction over a decade prior. They had been held privately, outside the estate, and transferred through a private testamentary mechanism that was both intentional and documented. The estate had received everything Harold had declared as estate property. The bonds had never been estate property. The claim was dismissed. Chester sat very still for a moment after the gavel came down. Pauline touched his arm briefly. He stood when everyone else stood, walked out of the courtroom at the same pace he had walked into it. Outside on the courthouse steps, the November air hit him cold and clean. The retired constable was waiting near the bottom of the steps, with Beau on a lead. The moment Beau saw Chester, the dog surged forward, pulling the lead taut, tail working hard. Chester crouched down. Beau pressed into him, and Chester held the dog's head in both hands and said nothing for a moment. Then he said quietly, "We're all right, buddy." Beau wagged his tail and looked at him. They drove back to Lacombe that afternoon. Chester didn't turn the radio on. He didn't need to fill the silence. Beau sat in the passenger seat with his nose toward the partially open window, watching the flat prairie roll by. Chester thought about Harold, about the brother he had never been close enough to, the one who had watched him from a distance for 30 years and understood more than he had ever let on. about a man who had sat on a fortune and done nothing extravagant with it because extravagance had never appealed to him, who had kept the money in a box and the key in a chair and the truth in a letter, and had trusted his quiet, undemanding, complicated brother to find it. Chester thought about that for a long time. The weeks after the hearing were strange ones. Pauline connected him with a financial planning firm in Edmonton that had experience with large inherited assets. They were careful people, which Chester appreciated. They did not talk to him the way people sometimes talk to old soldiers, slowly, with extra clarity, but like someone they expected to understand what they were saying. He did understand. He asked careful questions and took detailed notes and slept on things before agreeing to anything. The bonds were authenticated and converted. The total came to $153 million. Chester sat with that number for several days without doing much about it. He paid off the mortgage on his bungalow. He bought a new truck, nothing extravagant, a half-ton that didn't rattle on the highway. He got Beau assessed by the veterinarian in town and arranged for the best ongoing care the clinic offered. Then he started making phone calls. There was a Veterans Association chapter in Red Deer that had been running out of a rented basement for 9 years, holding peer support meetings on fold-out chairs under fluorescent lights. Chester had attended a few sessions there in the years after his discharge. He remembered the drive down, the parking lot, the stairs, the low ceiling. He remembered thinking that the space felt like a place that had never quite believed it deserved better. He met with the director, a retired corporal named Hugh who had served in Afghanistan. And they talked for 3 hours at a diner on Gates Avenue. Then Chester bought the vacant building across the road from that parking lot, a 2-story brick structure that had been a dental clinic, then a law office, then nothing. He hired a contractor from Lacombe, who had done good work on a neighbor's addition. He brought in an interior designer recommended by the Edmonton financial firm, a practical woman who asked what the space needed to do before she asked what it should look like. It needed to be a place where veterans felt like they were walking into something that had been built for them, not something that had been adapted for them, or offered to them out of charity, or squeezed into a corner of something else's budget. Something built for them. It took 18 months. Chester was involved in most of the decisions, not because he was the one with the expertise, but because he had learned in 31 years of service that the difference between a good outcome and a failed one is usually the degree to which someone in a position of authority stays present and paying attention. He named it after Harold. Not a grand naming, not a plaque ceremony with cameras. Just the words carved in good oak above the front door. Harold Malone Community Center for Veterans. Harold would have hated a fuss. Chester knew that. Beau became the unofficial first resident. Chester had discussed with the Veterans Association the possibility of a service dog program, pairing retired or trained dogs with veterans coming through the center's programs. Hugh had been enthusiastic. They had started small. 2 dogs in the first year, 4 in the second. By the time the center marked its 2nd anniversary, there were 11 animals working in the program, each paired through a careful process that Chester had helped design based on his own experience. On the morning of the 2nd anniversary, Chester stood near the front entrance and watched the parking lot fill. Veterans came in 1s and 2s, some drove alone, some were dropped off. A few walked from the bus stop at the corner. An old man in a Veterans Legion jacket arrived with his daughter, who held his arm on the icy path. Beau moved through the gathering crowd with the relaxed confidence of a dog who understood his purpose. He found the people who needed him without being directed. An older woman standing near the wall who looked like she was deciding whether to stay. A young man, not much past 30, Chester guessed, who had come in and then drifted toward the back of the room and was standing alone with his hands in his pockets. Beau walked to each of them. Slow, easy, no pressure. Chester watched all of it from near the door. After a while, Hugh came and stood beside him. You know, Hughes said we used to have meetings where 4 people showed up. Now we've got 3 programs running and a waiting list. Chester nodded. Hugh looked at Beau, who had settled beside the young man near the back wall. The man had one hand on the dog now, and his posture had changed slightly. Less closed, less braced. That dog of yours, Hugh said. He really knows. Chester looked over. Beau glanced up at him from across the room. Even at this distance, Chester could read the steadiness in those eyes, the same steadiness that had been there on the first night they had met, when Chester had still been sleeping poorly and jumping at sounds that weren't there. The same steadiness that had been there in Harold's garage, circling a broken chair that no one else had looked at twice. He knows, Chester agreed. That evening, after the others had left and the center had gone quiet, Chester drove back up to Lacombe. The fields along the highway were dark. A few farmhouses had their lights on. The sky was the dense, particular black of an Alberta winter night with no moon. He pulled into his driveway and sat in the truck for a moment. Then he went inside. Beau followed him into the living room and lay down near the wood stove. And in the corner where Chester had first set it down, the rocking chair still stood, repaired now, joints reglued, the crack in the leg filled and sanded smooth. Chester had finished the restoration himself over the summer, working slowly in the evenings, the way Harold would have done it. He sat down in it. The wood was warm from the fire's heat. The chair moved with that particular slow pendulum rhythm of a well-built rocker, the kind of movement that asks nothing from you and takes nothing away. Chester looked at Beau. Beau looked back at him. Outside, the spruce trees at the edge of the field moved in the wind. The fire settled. The house was quiet in the way that good houses get quiet at night. Not empty, just still. Chester had never needed much. 31 years in the service had shown him the difference between what a person wants and what a person actually requires. A dry billet. Something to do that mattered. Someone at your side who didn't need you to explain yourself. Harold had understood that. Had understood Chester better from a distance than most people did up close. The rocking chair moved slowly in the firelight, and Beau, stretched out on the floor beside it, closed his eyes.